Well, a number of years ago, I was invited to speak at a student group at Purdue on the subject, what does the Bible say about sex? And I thought, I'll accept that invitation. It seems like an interesting conversation. And one of the things I kind of pride myself on is being able to anticipate an audience, to kind of assess where will they think the Bible is surprising or boring, or where will it resonate, and try to get a sense of what people will expect. I realized after I did the talk that I had gotten that audience all wrong. And it wasn't because they were college students. You see, I know anytime you put the word sex in the title of a message or a talk, it garners some attention. But I grew up in a home where my parents spoke pretty openly and freely about sex and sexuality, and they wanted to lead myself and my two brothers to live with our sexuality in a way that was godly and honored God and was healthy. And one of the things I realized after my experience of talking to that group was how unique my experience growing up was. That most people, college students or not, did not grow up in the environment that I did, and most of the conversations that happened about sex and sexuality were just kind of off limits and certainly didn't necessarily include something from the Scriptures. In fact, I find that a lot of people are surprised that the Scriptures even speak to the idea of sex, let alone the idea of how it speaks to sex with its beauty, with its candor, and with its very reasonable warnings about how to handle this part of our lives. And so I thought it would be a healthy thing for us to start off 2018 by simply having a 3-week conversation about sex. Wouldn't you agree? Nervous laughter. That's what I've experienced all 3 services. There is a sense in which I know everyone's thinking, I hope he doesn't say something embarrassing. That's okay. We're going to have a conversation in the way that the Scriptures talk about it. Part of this conversation, just so you know, is I think as we try to look at what the Bible says about sex, it'll take us 3 weeks. And so in some ways, this is one message over the course of 90 minutes and 3 weeks. And while today I'm going to talk about the purpose of sex, over the next few weeks we'll talk about how to handle some of the parameters that God puts on sex. And then I'm going to talk in the last week in some very practical ways about the priority of sex in our lives. I also want you to know, as we've mentioned a couple of times, that this is kind of rated PG-13, or I think most appropriately said, good for middle school and up, not so good for 5th grade and below. So it's your last chance to get your 3rd grader out of here. Good. So let me just start with this question. Why would I teach about sex? Let me name one primary reason before I get to the outline. The primary reason is because I want your relationships to be extraordinary. I really do. I want you to go through life with extraordinary relationships. And if you're married, I can promise you that if your sexual life is a healthy sexual life, you will have a much healthier marriage. And if the truth is, your sexual life is not all that healthy, or it's difficult, or it's marked by shame, that your marriage will not be thriving. That's true. And if you're not married, I really hope that this conversation gives you some insight into the way God thought about sex when He designed it, and that you draw your life into alignment with that. I think it could potentially save you a great deal of regret over the course of your life. And one of the prayers that I just prayed before I walked up here was that for some of you who are not married right now, but will be married one day, I prayed that your future spouse, whether you know them now or not, would thank God that you heard these messages. I think they can shape our lives and our relationships in that powerful of a way. But let me name 2 very particular things I want to accomplish by talking about this. First, I want to start the conversations about sex and sexuality. I want to start conversations between married couples. I want you to feel free to have conversations about this element of your life that sometimes doesn't get talked about. I want to give you a level of content, some ideas to talk about, and start to say, we could talk about this freely. If you're in a relationship but you're not married right now, I want to start that conversation for you. To say, what would it look like to think about sex in the way the Scriptures think about it, and to see if our lives are in alignment with how the Scriptures think about it. Some of you are single, but you're not in a relationship right now. But you have friends, other friends that are single, and I think you're navigating a season of life right now, if you're dating, that's full of potential pitfalls and minefields. It's full of expectations and some God-given desires inside of you, and you're trying to reconcile all of that. And I think this is something we should talk about with one another to navigate this in a healthy way. I hope to start some conversations between parents and teenagers. I've heard a few whispers that parents thought they were going to bring their teenagers for these 3 weeks so that I'd have the conversation. I'll begin it. I need you to carry it on from there. It will be so valuable, even when it's uncomfortable at times. And maybe most importantly, I want to start a conversation between you and God. And to say, God, if this is how you made sex, and this is why you made sex, and this is what you had in mind when you made sex, what would it look like for me to try to align my life with that? And God, what do I do when it's hard or when I mess up or all those sorts of things? To have an open dialogue with the creator of the world. We call it prayer. But you can talk about subjects even like this. So I want to start conversations. But in addition to just starting the conversations, I think that there's a role that the church ought to be playing in lifting the conversations about sex. To lift them up to a wholesome place, to a beautiful place, to a place with candor. You see, some of the scriptures I'll use today and in future weeks come from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, the opening chapters of the Bible. And if you've ever heard me describe creation and brokenness and redemption and restoration, then you know the whole picture of creation, that created world, that was the world just the way God wanted it to be. And what we get in God's words about sex and sexuality, many of them come from that idea. It's interesting. When Adam and Eve are created, they're created naked. And the scriptures talk in that opening setting that says, and they had no shame. No shame. And I think, oh, what if we could have conversations? What if we could lift a conversation where it isn't a shame-based conversation? It isn't a guilt-based conversation. It isn't a whispers conversation. It's a beautiful, healthy, and necessary conversation. A number of years ago, I was hanging out in the backyard of my neighbor. There was kind of a party in our neighborhood, and I was sitting around a table just talking with the neighbors, and someone at the table, a lady who's a friend of ours, she started to tell a story about she and her husband, and as she was telling the story, she mentioned that she and her husband were living together before they were married. Now, this just happens because I'm a pastor, okay? Sometimes just being present as a pastor means you are the conscience of every conversation. And people stop and they'll pause and they note it. And that happened on this occasion. And she realized she had said that they were living together before they were married. And she kind of stopped and looked at me and she said, Greg, I know that's against the church rules. And I thought, oh, what an interesting way to say it. Against the church rules. Because what I want to talk to you about over the next few weeks should not be reduced to church rules. I know sometimes that's how they get portrayed. The things you should do and not do if you're a good church person. But this conversation is so much broader than that. It's about who God is and how He created you and the design He had for this part of your life. And I think it will make a lot more sense to all of us when we look at it holistically and in a lofty way rather than just as a few rules that everybody's supposed to follow. And so there's a few particular ways I want to lift this conversation. Here's the first one. I want to lift it from being a casual conversation to a sacred conversation. To make it a little more lofty, I know that the way sex gets talked about in our culture today is very casual, isn't it? I mean, if you just turn on the radio, it's a part of most every song. It's present in lots of movies. If you go on the internet, of course, it's everywhere. That's the nature of sex today. It actually makes it so that it loses a little bit of its shock value and of its loftiness, and it just becomes a little bit mundane. It wasn't that long ago when a Viagra commercial would come on TV and everyone would blush a little bit, but nobody blushes anymore. That's just the nature of the conversation today. We refer to things like casual sex, friends with benefits, and people who think porn is no big deal at all. And I want to ask you to think about that in an entirely different way. To say that the scriptures actually have a way of thinking and talking about sex that move it from being casual to something that's loftier and something that's sacred, something that's beautiful and powerful when we talk about it. And I'd like to lift the conversation to there. It's not prudish, I can promise you that. Second, I want to lift the conversation from being physical to being relational. Almost always these days when people just casually talk about sex, they think about sex as a physical act. And of course that's part of it. But if you see how God designed the whole idea of sex and sexuality, the physical is never detached from the relational. That whatever's happening within a sexual relationship, it happens between two people who share something together. But in today's world, It's possible that many people who are having sexual experiences aren't having them with a person at all. They're having them with a screen. They're having them with a thought. Or even when they are having them with people, it's not a person that they value. It's a person who's become nothing more than an object or a commodity to them. To move on from one to the next, to treat someone as an object. And I'm so frustrated by how unhealthy this is. I hear guys talk about this. And I've talked with enough women leading into this conversation to know that it's not just guys who talk this way. But guys will say something like this. They'll say, oh, I'd like a piece of that. I'd like to tap that. And I think, that? These are people. These are persons who share a relationship and life together. And the moment you reduce sex from being relational to only physical, you've reduced the person to being an object or a commodity that might as well be bought or sold or traded or whatever. And I don't think that's okay. I mean, it comes to us this way because in lots of our cultural conversations, take music for example, people, women, sometimes men, get referred to with words that are really just sexual object words. In fact, I'm going to just challenge you with something I think pretty simple this morning. If you have any music on your playlist, on your phone or whatever, and I know this is kind of music people listen to today, but if that music at any point refers to a woman as a bitch or a whore, I think you should just delete that today. You should delete it within 20 minutes after this service today. Because one of the massive problems with the way that we think about sex is that we think of other people as objects for our pleasure rather than people to share something with. Here's a third way I want to raise the conversation. From receiving to giving. Now, it's kind of inherent in our broken human experience to be selfish about most everything. And in the conversations I do have with people about the nature of sex and sexuality in their lives, if the conversation ever gets to this point, it becomes pretty obvious that most people see their sexual relationship through one question. And here's the question: is it satisfying to me? It's almost always entirely self-focused. Am I satisfied with how my sexual relationship is or isn't right now? And I think the moment we go there, the moment we've missed out on the relational component of this and the basic biblical principle of marriage, which is that I'm more concerned about the other than I am about me. Now, at its core, any conversation about sex is a conversation about relationships. This is a relational message series. And the biggest problem I have in every relational message series that I do is this. Everyone who's sitting here and listening might be more prone to apply my messages to someone else rather than themselves. It's quite possible you could sit over the course of this message today and think, boy, I'm glad my wife's here today. She really needs to hear this. Or I wish my husband were here today. And we tend to think about things in those ways. But the moment it goes there, the moment we start applying it to someone else before we apply it to ourselves, is the moment it all goes wrong. And so I want the conversation to be one that's marked with unselfishness rather than selfishness. And so that's my reasons for having this conversation about sex. Let me just go to the second question then, which gets at the core of all this. Why in the world would God create sex? Why would God create sex? Of course, inherent in the question is an assumption that God did create sex, and clearly he did. But if you stop and think, God created sex, it would be healthy to back up from that conversation, from that idea for just a moment and say, oh, well, when God's creating, how does he do that? And one of the answers to that is he always does it with purpose. He doesn't create things that don't have a purpose. And so he must have had an end in mind when he created the whole idea and expression of sex. And over the course of the next few minutes here, I'm going to outline for you what I think are the three primary, maybe not the only, but the three primary reasons that God even created sex. I think if you listen, you'll be kind of impressed with God and the way that he weaves these together so they work in purposes together. But here's the real question for all of us today. Some of you I know are not followers of Jesus. You come to our church for a variety of reasons, and maybe you're exploring what faith is all about, but you're not there yet. You wouldn't say you believe. If that's who you are today, I hope you know I would never hold someone who's not a follower of Jesus accountable to what the Scriptures say. I think that's a little crazy. But I do always want to present the Scriptures in a way, and I think the message on sexuality will do this, so that you could see, oh, that's who God is. And I actually think over the next 3 weeks, in a way that you may have never expected, that a message series about sex could make you think, I could trust a God like that. The rest of us in the room are followers of Jesus. It defines our lives. It's who we say we are. And if you're a follower of Jesus, then I really have one request, a very direct request for you today. That today, as I talk about why God created sex, what the purpose of sex was in His mind, that you would just listen and come to the conclusion that if that was God's purpose for sex, then it will also be your purpose for sex. That you will align your purposes around God's purposes and say, I'd like to share these. I'd like to express my sexuality in a way that aligns with God Himself. And so having said that, let me describe these 3 purposes that sex has according to the Scriptures. The first is to foster intimacy within a marriage. Now, the word intimacy is an interesting word because it's actually a word that we use as a euphemism for sex. People will talk about being intimate. But let me, for a moment, detach the idea of intimacy from the sexual expression. Because you and I know that you have certain relationships, not related to sex at all, where you either experience more intimacy or less intimacy. This is a very important idea because in the most satisfying human relationships, in the healthiest human relationships, there's a shared intimacy together. And the formula for how you get to intimacy is not difficult. It essentially has to do with how vulnerable you are willing to be and how vulnerable the person you want to have the relationship is willing to be with you. Someone said once, and I totally believe it, that you can only be loved to the degree that you're known. And most of us don't reveal everything about ourselves. We keep certain parts of our lives hidden. We keep certain parts kind of covered. We don't share everything that we think, everything that we feel, everything from our past with someone else. And the reason we don't is because we don't trust how they would react to it, and so we decide just to conceal that part of our lives. But it also means that the moment we conceal it, we know that now someone is just loving a version of us. They're not loving the real us. Because you can only be loved to the degree that you allow yourself to be known. But to have a relationship where you are fully known, where you don't have to hide anything, where there don't have to be secrets, where you can trust, you know this is a safe place, where someone could know everything about you and they would accept you for who you are. And that it would be mutual, that you could know everything about them and you would accept them for who they are. That's a beautiful relationship. That's intimacy. And it's why intimacy is so powerful. The pinnacle of intimacy can only be achieved when it's a relationship between only 2 people. It's the most private and secure relationship that trust can have. Think about it this way. We talk not just about intimacy with others, but maybe intimacy with God. How much of your life you reveal to God will come to lead you to either an intimate relationship or not an intimate relationship. I say a prayer at the end of every message here, and I can promise you when I say that prayer, it's a sincere prayer, it's an honest prayer, it's a prayer I hope God will hear, and I hope that He'll answer. But I can also promise you this, when I say the prayer and hundreds of you are listening, there are things I'm not going to say in my prayer. I'm not going to confess my deepest, darkest sins while you're all listening. There's some things I'll say only to God. And I trust that God can handle it. It's a trust. This is intimacy. Now, what's that have to do with sex? Everything. Because in the sexual relationship, what's happening is in the physical part of a marriage, you are becoming willing to entrust everything about you, to conceal nothing, and to put your place and trust with someone with whom you feel safe. The Bible describes how this would look in the very opening chapters of the Bible. It says, then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man and brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And then get this. That is why when a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, they become one flesh. Now, I read that passage at almost every wedding ceremony I do. Usually, I just leave off the word flesh. Because it's a beautiful concept, even without flesh. The two would become one. That's the idea of Christian marriage. But it's almost as if God wants to make sure we know that present within that covenant of marriage is a sharing of your whole self, including the uniting of your flesh. That's the design for intimacy within a marriage. Now, if you've been around very long, you've probably heard me talk about the different kinds of relationships there are. You can put them in two categories. There's consumer relationships and there's covenant relationships. And every time I talk about this, I want to go to great lengths to say consumer relationships aren't evil. I'm not trying to cast them as good and bad. I'm just casting them for what they are. And here's what consumer relationships are. That's what most of your relationships are. You engage someone and you think, hey, this is good, it's working for me. There's something I'm getting out of this, and there's probably something they're getting out of it. And then at some point, maybe it stops working for you, or you stop getting what you wanted, and when that happens, you move on from the relationship. That's how almost all relationships work. That's why you're not best friends with everyone now that you were when you were in college. But there is a different kind of relationship, a fundamentally different kind of relationship, which is a marriage relationship, and it's marked by a covenant that is made between two people. And instead of being the kind of relationship, a marriage, where you might say, oh, I'm with you until it doesn't work for me and then I'm going to move on, marriage is exactly the opposite. Marriage says, I'm with you, period. And I'm actually going to promise you in our vows that when things are great, I'm with you, and when things are awful, you got to know this, I'm still with you. And when we're rich, I'm with you, and if we're dirt poor, I'm with you. And if you're healthy and we're thriving, awesome, but if you're sick, you're not going to go through it alone. I'm with you. That is the very nature of a covenant. It means that I'm secure and I'm safe. And I can trust that even when things are tough, we're going to be in this together. It is the exact kind of relationship where intimacy can thrive. And that is why, my friends, not because it's a church rule, that is why God designs that intimacy in your sexual relationship ought to be reserved for the moment after you've made the covenant. And you know that someone's going to be with you no matter what. There's another purpose that God gives to sexuality. It's to enjoy pleasure in a marriage. And sometimes, I guess, maybe pleasure gets a little undersold, but if you read the scriptures from beginning to end, you will come to this conclusion that God had in mind when he created sex that it should be fun, that it should be enjoyable, that it should be pleasurable. You would have a drive inside of you that wants to do it. That's part of the whole design of this. You start weaving these three purposes together. I'm going to read to you just a short passage from a book in the Old Testament. It's called the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. And what this book really is a dialogue between Solomon, wisest man who ever lived. He wrote the Proverbs, he wrote Ecclesiastes. This is him writing about a relationship he has with his wife. And the first lines in this are him speaking to her, and then there's some lines toward the end where she speaks to him. And I want you to just listen to this passage with me and think, how could part of the design be anything but pleasure when we see this described in the scriptures? Solomon says, how beautiful you are, and how pleasing, my love, with your delights. Your stature is like that of the palm, and your breasts like clusters of fruit. I said, I will climb the palm tree, and I will take hold of its fruit. May your breasts be like clusters of grapes on the vine, and the fragrance of your breath like apples, and your mouth like the best wine. May the wine go straight to my beloved, flowing gently over lips and teeth. I belong, this is her speaking, I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. Let us go early to the vineyards to see if the vines have budded, if their blossoms have opened, and if the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. Whew. That's good stuff. Some of you might want to read that tonight. I'm just... pleasure was part of the design here. And I have to tell you this. A month ago or so, you heard me say that to kind of consecrate this worship space that we're in as we did the addition, we decided one of the things we'd do is have the scriptures read out loud right here on the platform from beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. And we had about 100 different leaders sign up for their parts of reading through that. And some of it went through the night, so some people were here reading and there was no one else in the room. But if you were here during the day, all the construction workers were around. And I was so interested to see who got this passage as they were reading with all the construction workers around. If it was you, tell me later. I think that's awesome. There's like this electrician and working over here, like, what in the... So foster intimacy, to experience pleasure, that's part of the design, it's part of the idea. And here's a third purpose. Purpose is to create children within a marriage. So as you might imagine, when God's thinking about how he's going to design the world and he conceives all of this in his mind, he has an interest in human beings flourishing. He loves us. He wants us to experience settings that would give us the greatest chance to thrive and to flourish. And so he actually designs that sex and sexuality would be shared within a marriage and that children would be brought into the world within marriages. Now, I know within this room there's dozens, if not hundreds, of people who are on one side of this or the other. You say, that wasn't my story. I was brought into the world outside of a marriage. Or maybe you're a single mom at this point or a single dad and you're raising kids that you don't have a partner with you raising those. I got to tell you, for people who work through what was not originally God's design and try to keep honoring God and work through it, it's beautiful. I have so much respect for people who work through that. But it shouldn't take away from the idea that when God designed the world, the idea is to make the world the most secure place, the place for people to have the chance to thrive, that children would be created within the context of a marriage. And of course, it's our expression of sex that creates those children. That was part of the whole idea here. The way my parents would say it to me is they'd say, Greg, you're ready to have sex when you're ready to be a father. And you're ready to be a father when you've made a vow to someone else that they would be the mother. It's not crazy, is it? It's actually a beautiful way for conceiving the world. And this is the way it's described in Genesis. So God created mankind in his image, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, and then subdue it. And part of what God had in mind, and doesn't this make sense with an aura of beauty and loftiness, is that when he weaves together the purposes of intimacy and pleasure and making sure the earth is populated, he puts this all in a beautiful scenario that we call sex. Now, this is just week 1 of the series. And I hope that it starts some conversations for you. And I hope you really think about aligning your life with the purposes that God had when he created this idea of sex, first of all. One of my hopes for you, one of my prayers for you, is that as you get to the end of this series, you'll be able to kind of look at your own life in light of the image of God and just say, I want his way. Let me pray for that right now. Heavenly Father, you're a good and a gracious God. When we see how you designed the world, if we're willing to step back and look, then, God, I pray even beginning today, we can see that you have good in mind for us. God, I know that I offer this prayer today over a room of people, some who are experiencing great strain in their relationships, even their sexual relationship. Some who are not experiencing joy or pleasure. I know in this room today there could be guilt and shame. God, truly my prayer is that we understand you and your way, is that we wouldn't carry guilt or shame, but we would simply step into repentance and renewal. God, thanks for some clarity, for not shying away from this idea. I pray we all trust in you. In the name of Jesus, amen.